In the winter of 1962, an American photo analyst unrolls a strip of satellite film onto a light table in Washington. He's looking for missile silos in the Siberian interior. What he finds instead makes no sense. A 60-kilometer stretch of a Siberian river is completely open water, no ice, columns of steam rising off the surface, in a region where the temperature outside sits at nearly minus 30 degrees Celsius. Every other kilometer of that river, for hundreds of miles in each direction, is frozen solid. Rivers don't do this on their own. Something enormous and clearly man-made is heating that water from below. And according to every official Soviet map on record, there is nothing at that location at all. No town, no factory, no name. Just forest. This is the story of what the Americans eventually found buried under that forest, and how, for nearly 30 years, 100,000 people lived inside it without officially existing. Rewind 7 years earlier, deep in the ministry that ran the entire Soviet nuclear weapons program, an organization powerful enough to run its own trains, its own farms, and its own private army, engineers select a ridge of solid granite on the eastern bank of the Yenisei River. Not for its scenery, for its ability to survive a direct nuclear strike, and for the volume of freezing river water running past its base. The plan is almost absurd in scale. Hollow out the mountain itself and build an entire underground plutonium production complex inside the rock. Reactor halls the height of 20-story buildings, blasted out of solid granite, then reinforced against a shock wave with steel arches built to flex independently of the mountain around them. And then, on the surface directly above it, build a city to house the 100,000 people needed to run it. A real city, theaters, tree-lined boulevards, a man-made lake carved out of the forest. A city that, on paper, does not exist. Every scrap of steel and every bag of cement for this had to disappear from the official Soviet economy without a trace, rerouted mid-shipment onto unmarked rail spurs that vanished into the forest, while the paperwork said the material had simply been consumed by ordinary regional construction. Hiding materials was a logistics problem. Hiding 100,000 living, breathing people from their own extended families was something else entirely. Recruits, physicists, engineers, straight out of the best universities in Moscow and Leningrad, didn't just take a new job, they effectively vanished. Letters from home were addressed to a numbered post office box in a real, ordinary city dozens of miles away, screened for any hint of the mountain, the river, or the trains, then physically driven into a sealed zone their own families believed didn't exist. There's a common assumption that a city like this must have functioned like a labor camp, barbed wire, deprivation, forced labor. That's not what made this system work. What made it work was closer to the opposite. Inside the wire, residents lived better than almost anyone else in the Soviet Union. Fresh fruit in the dead of Siberian winter, imported clothing, spacious apartments that an ordinary Soviet family might wait 20 years to receive. The state wasn't just imprisoning these people, it was buying their silence with a standard of living most of the country could only imagine. And it worked precisely because the residents had far more to lose than most. But underneath the boulevards and the theaters, the actual engineering problem hadn't gone away. You cannot simply carve a cavern the height of a 20-story building into solid rock and walk away. Remove that much granite, and the stress patterns in the surrounding stone shift dramatically. Without careful reinforcement, a void that size will collapse under its own weight. And there was a second problem, one the engineers couldn't solve with concrete. The tens of thousands of conscripted laborers who spent years blasting those tunnels now knew, in exact physical detail, the layout of the Soviet Union's most sensitive nuclear facility. When the first reactor was ready to go critical, every one of those workers had to disappear too, scattered across dozens of other classified sites nationwide, bound by non-disclosure orders, tracked for decades by internal state security to make sure the knowledge in their heads never resurfaced in a hometown bar. By the early 1960s, 3 separate plutonium production reactors were running simultaneously deep inside the mountain, an achievement the Soviet state considered its most secure nuclear asset. Buried under 200 meters of granite, invisible to any surveillance aircraft, seemingly untouchable. There was just one problem nobody in the design phase had fully accounted for. 3 nuclear reactors, running continuously, generate a staggering, unrelenting amount of heat. Heat that has to go somewhere, or the reactor cores melt themselves apart within hours. The engineer's solution was straightforward. Pull millions of liters of freezing river water into the mountain every hour to absorb that heat, then discharge it back into the Yenisei. Inside the complex, it worked exactly as designed. The reactors stayed stable, production stayed on schedule. Outside the mountain, though, physics didn't care about state secrecy. The sheer volume and temperature of that discharge water was enough to overpower a Siberian winter outright. And that's exactly what a camera in orbit caught on film in 1962. Soviet engineers, once they realized what had happened, tried to fix it, forcing the hot discharge water deep into the riverbed instead of releasing it near the surface, hoping to mix it with the cold current before it could rise and steam. It helped. Some. It did not come close to solving the problem. 3 operating reactors were simply generating more heat than any underwater diffuser could hide, and the river kept glowing on infrared long after the visible steam columns had been suppressed. For the rest of the Cold War, both sides lived with the resulting paradox. The Americans now had the coordinates. They knew the estimated output. The facility had been folded into targeting plans years before its own residents were ever told their secret had already failed. And yet, on the ground, absolutely nothing changed. The gates stayed locked. The mail still went through the sensors. 100,000 people continued pretending, every day, that a city with a name did not exist. Because dismantling that fiction would have meant admitting, out loud, that it had already been seen. If the secret was already gone, what was left to actually protect? The mission, or just the system built to protect it? The most unexpected twist in this story didn't arrive until the Soviet Union itself collapsed. By the early 1990s, the state that built the mountain was gone. The ministry that ran it was dissolved. But the reactors inside the granite could not simply be switched off, because decades earlier, the city's entire power and heating grid had been wired directly into the plant's waste heat. No reactor meant no heat, in a region where winter temperatures fall to -40. Shutting it down risked freezing an entire city of 100,000 people to death in their own apartments. So for nearly 20 more years, long after the Cold War that justified building the plant had ended, a Russian nuclear reactor kept manufacturing weapons-grade plutonium nobody wanted anymore, not for strategy, but because a forgotten city needed hot water. It took a joint American-Russian engineering effort, the same 2 governments that had spent decades hiding this facility from each other, to finally build a conventional power plant and shut the reactor down for good. In 2010, nearly 2 decades after the country that built it had ceased to exist. The mountain is sealed today. The reactors are cold. The city above it has a name now, openly, on a map anyone can look up. So here's the question worth sitting with. The engineers built a mountain fortress designed to survive a war that never came, and in doing so, built a machine so deeply woven into 100,000 ordinary lives that even after the empire behind it collapsed, nobody could figure out how to turn it off. Was the real trap ever the mountain, or was it always the city built on top of it?